The whisper that changed everything. The neon hum of the Skyline Gas and Mart flickered in the night, casting pale blue glows over cracked pavement and rust-stained fuel pumps. The air was thick with the stale scent of gasoline and the heavy silence that often wraps around lonely highway stops after midnight. Officer Samuel Grady parked his cruiser on the edge of the lot, his eyes flicking over the near-empty station, already preparing for just another welfare check. Drunk driver, parked half in, half out of a space. Kid in the passenger seat. Dispatch had been brief. Officer Grady had handled more of these than he could count. The clerk, a wiry man with jittery hands and a face worn from too many night shifts, waved frantically from the glass door. His mouth moved in rapid bursts, the words muffled through the glass, but the fear was written clear across his face. Grady stepped out, his boots crunching against loose gravel, the weight of the night settling heavier with each step. The truck sat unevenly, its front bumper pressed awkwardly against a dented trash bin. The engine rumbled faintly, just enough to keep the cab warm in the cool air. The driver's side door hung wide open, its interior light revealing a man slumped against the steering wheel, head down, one arm dangling out, fingers twitching sporadically. Officer Grady knew the type at a glance. Sweat-stained flannel, cracked knuckles, and the unmistakable sag of a man who's been running from his own reflection for too long. But it wasn't the man that made Grady pause. It was the small figure huddled in the passenger seat. Barefoot, pajama pants clinging to spindly legs, and a tattered stuffed lion crushed against his chest like a life preserver. The boy couldn't have been older than 4, his dark curls flattened against his forehead, his wide eyes tracking Grady's every step with the silent plea of a child who's been here before. "Hey there, buddy," Grady said softly, crouching low beside the open door. "My name's Sam. You okay?" The boy's fingers clutched the lion tighter, his knuckles white against the faded orange fur. His lips trembled, teeth digging into his lower lip so hard Grady thought he might draw blood. Then, barely louder than the breeze, the boy whispered a single word. "Drunk." Grady's chest tightened like a vice, the word hitting harder than any shouted accusation ever could. That kind of understanding, the resignation of a child too young to know that word so intimately, left no room for doubt. This wasn't the first time. "All right, buddy. It's okay now," Grady promised, even though he knew promises were fragile things in a life like this. The boy, who Grady would later learn was named Caleb, slid out of the truck without being asked, his small feet curling against the cold pavement. He didn't run, didn't cry, just stood there, trembling, his lion dragging behind him, its worn tail sweeping the concrete. Grady stepped to the driver's side, giving the man a firm shake. "Sir, wake up." The man stirred, eyelids fluttering open to reveal bloodshot eyes swimming in confusion. His breath rolled out in a thick cloud of whiskey and regret, the kind of stench that sticks to your uniform even after you wash it. "Come on, let's step out of the truck," Grady said, bracing for the resistance. The man's head lolled to the side, lips moving around words that never formed. When Grady tried to guide him out, the man's arm flailed, not with the intention to strike, but with the sluggish resistance of someone too drunk to know who they were fighting. Grady caught him under the arms before he could collapse completely. The weight of him, a grown man held upright by nothing more than duty and muscle memory, made Grady's knees ache. The man's breath puffed against Grady's shoulder, mumbled apologies spilling out in a garbled mess. "I just needed to get home," the man slurred, his knees buckling again. "My boy." Grady didn't respond. There were no words that could soften what came next. As the handcuffs clicked shut, the man slumped against the hood of the cruiser, his head bowed like a condemned man awaiting sentencing. Caleb stood a few feet away, his sobs silent but visible in the way his chest hitched and his shoulders shook. He didn't move to his father, didn't try to stop what was happening. And that was what broke Grady's heart the most, that absence of fight, the acceptance born from too many nights just like this one. "Call CPS," Grady said into his shoulder radio, his voice flat with the weight of it. "We've got a miner involved." As backup arrived, Caleb's resolve finally cracked. The sight of his father being lowered into the back of the cruiser was too much. "Daddy!" Caleb's scream ripped through the night, raw and broken, tearing through every layer of calm Grady had carefully built over his years on the force. The man, Jacob McLean, lifted his head for the first time. His eyes struggled to focus, but the sound of his son's voice cut through the haze. "Caleb, I'm sorry, bud, I'm sorry." The boy surged forward, only stopped by Grady's gentle hand on his shoulder. "Let me help you, buddy," Grady said softly. "I know this is scary." Caleb's small hand found Grady's, fingers curling tight around the unfamiliar warmth. His stuffed lion dangled from his other hand, its button eyes reflecting the flashing red and blue lights dancing across the pavement. The CPS worker arrived a few minutes later, a woman with tired eyes and a gentle smile named Linda Ross. She knelt beside Caleb, her voice soft as she asked him questions he couldn't answer through his tears. Eventually, she lifted him into her arms, his sobs muffled against her shoulder as they walked toward her car. Jacob's forehead rested against the glass partition in the back of the cruiser, his breath fogging up the window as he watched his son disappear into the night. "Please," Jacob whispered, his voice cracking. "Please don't take him." Grady didn't respond. What could he say to a man who had already taken so much from himself? The drive to the station was silent, save for Jacob's occasional murmured apologies to no one in particular. His head sagged forward, every mile stripping away another layer of his bravado, until nothing was left but raw, unvarnished shame. At the station, they booked him quickly. Mugshot, fingerprints, personal effects, all the motions that blurred together into the cold, mechanical process of processing a man who had long since given up on himself. In the quiet holding cell, Jacob sat alone, the weight of the cuffs replaced by the heavier weight of silence. His head dropped into his hands, fingers digging into his scalp, until his knuckles blanched. On the far side of town, Caleb sat curled up on a stiff couch in a temporary foster home, his stuffed lion clutched so tightly it seemed threatened to split. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his father's face, the fear, the confusion, and the guilt, all tangled together in a mask of a man he both loved and feared. But even after everything, Caleb whispered a word into the dark, the same word he'd whispered in the gas station parking lot, not to Officer Grady this time, but to the lion cradled in his arms. Try. Because in the heart of a child, no matter how broken the world seemed, there was always room for hope. The weight of silence. The holding cell felt smaller by the hour. The concrete walls, marred with faint scratches and graffiti from inmates past, seemed to press in closer with each breath. Jacob McLean sat on the metal bench bolted to the wall, his head in his hands, the ache in his skull throbbing with every thud of his heartbeat. His fingers still smelled faintly of gasoline, a lingering reminder of how the night had started. But under that was something worse. The sour scent of whiskey seeping from his pores, the stench of sweat laced with fear, and the faint, almost phantom trace of Caleb's shampoo clinging to his flannel sleeve. He couldn't get the image of his son out of his head. Those wide eyes, too wise for 4 years old. The way his small hand clutched the tattered lion, dragging it along the pavement like some ancient knight hauling his broken shield into battle. Caleb had stood there, still and silent, just watching, like a soldier witnessing the inevitable fall of his last fortress. Jacob had thought he'd known rock bottom before, the first time he woke up in a detox cell at County, the day he found an eviction notice stapled to the warped door of their old trailer, the afternoon he realized his own mother had changed her phone number to avoid his calls. But none of that compared to watching his son pulled away from him in the arms of a stranger, knowing the only person Caleb truly depended on was the same man destroying his life. The clang of the cell door opening yanked him back to reality. "On your feet, McLean." The deputy's voice was flat, practiced. No sympathy, no malice. Just another broken man passing through the system. Jacob rose, legs shaking, balance still off from the aftershocks of his last drink. His hands curled into fists at his sides, not out of anger, but to hide the tremors that had begun. The withdrawal creeping in, whispering its promises of relief if he could just get his hands on something, anything to take the edge off. He was led down the narrow hall, the walls painted a shade of beige so lifeless it made his teeth itch. Each step echoed, the sound bouncing back at him like some distorted ghost of himself, hollow and endless. They stopped at a heavy door. The deputy knocked once, and it swung open to reveal a small interview room. Gray metal table, 2 chairs, and a woman sitting with her back straight, and a thin manila folder resting in front of her. She couldn't have been older than 40, but the lines around her mouth and the sharpness in her eyes spoke of a woman who'd spent her life navigating the wreckage of other people's bad decisions. Her name was Diana Morales, his court-appointed attorney, and she looked at him like she'd already heard every excuse he was about to offer. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Jacob sat, the metal freezing through his thin jail uniform. His hands fidgeted, fingers pulling at his sleeves, trying to fold them into neat lines. Anything to occupy himself. Diana flipped open the folder, her pen tapping against the paper in a slow, rhythmic beat. "I read the report," she began, her tone cool and professional. "Child endangerment, driving under the influence, resisting arrest." "I didn't resist," Jacob croaked, his throat raw and dry. I was confused." Diana's dark eyes pinned him to his seat. "You took a swing at the officer, Mr. McLean. That's on video. We're not arguing semantics." Jacob slumped back in his chair, the fight bleeding out of him as quickly as it had flared. "How's Caleb?" he asked, the words brittle and uneven. Diana's expression softened slightly, just enough to reveal there was a human being under the lawyer's mask. "He's with a temporary foster placement right now. Safe, that's all I know." "Foster," Jacob whispered, the word curling in his gut like acid. Foster homes were for kids whose parents didn't want them, or kids whose parents were too far gone to matter anymore. The fact that his son was now one of those kids made his stomach churn. Diana's pen tapped again, quicker this time, a subtle warning that there wasn't time for self-pity. "You've got court in the morning. The judge assigned to your case, Judge Keegan, doesn't play games. Your record's working against you." Jacob swallowed hard. "My record? 4 public intoxication charges in the last 2 years," she listed, her voice sharp and unflinching. 2 DUIs, both dismissed after mandatory classes. 1 domestic disturbance call that ended with you passed out on your front lawn while your kid sat on the porch waiting for the school bus. Jacob's stomach twisted. He remembered that day. The burning sunlight, the cold dew on the grass, the way Caleb's voice had cut through his hangover haze. "Daddy, I gotta go to school." "Look, I know you don't need me to tell you how bad this looks," Diana said, leaning forward, her elbows resting on the table. "But I'm going to tell you anyway. You're out of second chances. The state is already pushing for permanent removal. If you don't show the court you're serious about turning this around, you lose Caleb for good." The words hit harder than any fist ever had. Jacob forced himself to meet her gaze, the reality sinking into his bones. "What do I have to do?" Diana leaned back, arms folding across her chest. "Rehab. Full inpatient. Minimum 90 days. Regular testing. And you show up for every single supervised visit they allow you." Jacob's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. 90 days. 3 months. A lifetime when you've spent every day numbing yourself just to make it through the next. "I can't lose him," Jacob whispered, barely aware he was speaking aloud. "Then prove it," Diana said, her voice softer now. "Because I promise you, if you half-ass this like every other time, you'll never see your son again." The words settled over him like a blanket of cold water, shocking, suffocating, and bracing all at once. The next morning, Courtroom C3 was packed with the usual cast of characters: overworked attorneys, tired social workers, and families tangled in the slow machinery of justice. Jacob sat at the defendant's table, his hands trembling against the polished wood. He hadn't seen Caleb yet, but he knew his son was somewhere nearby, probably clutching that lion, probably wondering why his dad wasn't there to make him breakfast. The bailiff called the case number, and the room fell into a hush as Judge Keegan entered. Her silver hair was pulled into a tight bun, her reading glasses perched at the end of her nose, and her expression one of exhausted patience. Diana rose. "Your Honor, this is the matter of Jacob McLean, case number 24176. We are prepared to enter a plea and discuss preliminary placement for his minor child, Caleb McLean." Jacob's mouth was dry. He barely heard the words. All he could see was Caleb's face that night, the tears pooling in his eyes, the way his lower lip quivered but didn't break. The boy had learned strength too young. "Mr. McLean," Judge Keegan's voice cut through the fog. "Do you understand the charges against you?" "Yes, Mom," Jacob managed, his voice hoarse. "And do you understand that you are at risk of permanently losing custody of your son?" Jacob's throat tightened. "I understand." The judge's gaze softened, just a fraction. "Mr. McLean, I have no interest in punishing parents for addiction, but I do have a responsibility to protect children. If you want to keep any hope of reunification with your son, you will check into residential treatment today. No delays, no excuses." Jacob nodded slowly, his stomach twisting into knots. The weight of silence, of the life he built on avoidance and denial, pressed heavy on his chest. "Do you accept these terms?" the judge asked. Jacob glanced toward the back of the courtroom. For one brief second, through the narrow crack of the door, he saw a flash of curly hair and a stuffed lion's paw. "I do," he said. The gavel fell like thunder. Beneath the surface, the iron gates of Clear Horizons Rehabilitation Center stood wide open, but to Jacob McLean, they felt like prison bars. His palms were slick with sweat as the police transport van slowed in front of the main building, its beige brick walls weathered and stained by years of storms, the literal kind and the human kind. The engine cut off, and the silence swallowed him whole. He didn't belong here, not with the hard cases, the ones who stole TVs for heroin or passed out behind dumpsters clutching paper bags. He wasn't like them, was he? He still had a job once, construction shifts, working with his hands, fixing things. He had a son. That made him different, didn't it? "Let's go," said the transport officer, a heavy-set man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He unlatched the side door, letting in a burst of clean air, the kind of fresh that only came from too many trees and too few gas stations. Jacob stepped out, his legs stiff from the ride, his stomach already twisted into knots from the early withdrawal writhing in his gut. Every part of him ached for something to take the edge off. Just one sip, one pull from a flask tucked into his coat. But his coat was gone. His flask, too. All he had now were empty hands and 78 days until he could see Caleb again. A man stood waiting just inside the building's front doors, broad shoulders, salt and pepper hair cropped short, arms folded like a man who'd seen every excuse, every lie, and every last-ditch promise too many times to count. His name tag read Gerald Ross, and his expression didn't shift as Jacob shuffled closer. "Welcome to Clear Horizons," Gerald said, voice low and even. "We believe in honesty here, so let me start you off with a freebie. If you're not ready to face your own reflection, you might as well walk back out that door." Jacob swallowed hard, his tongue dry as sandpaper. "I'm here for my son." Gerald's mouth quirked into something that could have been a smile, or maybe just a twitch. "Most of them are, but you can't do this for him. You do this for you, or you don't do it at all." Jacob didn't reply. Words had gotten him nowhere for years. Gerald led him down a long hallway where the air smelled like disinfectant and burnt coffee, the kind of institutional scent that stuck to your clothes. They passed the common room where a cluster of gaunt men and weary-eyed women slouched on threadbare couches. A TV played some mindless sitcom, laugh tracks echoing awkwardly in the space. Jacob kept his eyes down. The intake room was bare. A metal chair, a plastic tub for his belongings, and a laminated list of rules tacked to the wall. No contraband, no cell phones, no visitors for the first 30 days. His old wallet, the chain from his belt, even his shoelaces were taken. Every piece of his identity reduced to a checklist. The only thing they let him keep was a photograph of Caleb, worn at the edges from being handled too much. The colors faded, but the smile still clear. It was the only part of his life that hadn't been stained by alcohol, at least not directly. "Strip search," Gerald said, not unkindly, but without room for argument. Shame burned hot in Jacob's chest as he peeled off the ill-fitting clothes they'd given him at the jail. His skin was clammy, his ribs sharper than they should have been, his knuckles still raw from the night at the gas station. He stood there, exposed in every sense of the word, until Gerald handed him a pair of gray sweats and a plain t-shirt. "You're all set," Gerald said, leading him to his room. More a cell with a window than anything comforting. A twin bed with a plastic mattress, a steel desk bolted to the floor, a tiny mirror over the sink. The window was barred, but it let in enough light to remind him that the world was still out there, the world where Caleb waited. The first night was hell. His skin crawled like it was too tight for his bones, sweat pouring from him in waves, soaking the sheets beneath him. His muscles spasmed, fingers twitching toward something that wasn't there. The comforting burn of whiskey, the numbing oblivion that alcohol offered. Without it, every nerve screamed. He spent the night curled into himself, Caleb's picture clutched so tightly in his hand the corner bent, his son's smile twisted under the weight of Jacob's trembling grip. When the nausea hit, it came like a wave of poison. Jacob barely made it to the tiny bathroom, dry heaving until his ribs ached, the taste of bile coating his tongue. His body fought for every inch, demanding the poison it had been fed for years. By dawn, he was shaking so badly he could barely stand. Gerald found him that way, hunched over the sink, knuckles white, eyes bloodshot. "Still think you're not like the others?" Gerald asked quietly. Jacob didn't answer. The first group session was worse. The room was arranged in a circle, 12 chairs filled with men and women whose stories were etched in their hollow faces. Some were young, barely in their 20s, already worn thin by heroin or meth. Others were old enough to be Jacob's father, haunted eyes hiding behind thick glasses or bushy beards. When it was Jacob's turn, he stayed silent, fingers locked together until his knuckles turned white. What was there to say? That he was a screw-up. That he'd ruined every good thing in his life, and didn't even have a decent excuse. Finally, when the silence stretched too long, Gerald spoke up. "You're not the worst we've seen," Gerald said, leaning back in his chair, arms folded across his chest. "But you might be the most stubborn." That got a few chuckles from the circle, but Jacob didn't smile. A woman named Linda, her face drawn and her fingers twitching like she was still craving something, broke the silence. "You got a kid, don't you?" Jacob flinched. "Yeah." "What's his name?" The question was gentle, but it felt like a knife. "Caleb," Jacob said, the word barely more than a breath. Linda smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "That's a good name." Jacob didn't reply. But later, alone in his room, he whispered it again, just to hear it, just to remind himself why he was there. The days blurred into each other. Group therapy, withdrawal sweats, forced reflection, uncomfortable silence. Each time the craving came, and it always came, Jacob reached for Caleb's picture. Sometimes it helped. Sometimes it didn't. But he held on, teeth gritted, muscles trembling. On the 7th day, he stood in front of the mirror above the sink, staring at his own reflection. The man looking back was a stranger, gaunt, pale, hollow-eyed. His hair stuck out at odd angles, the stubble on his jaw uneven and patchy. But somewhere, deep beneath the wreckage, there was still a piece of himself he recognized. The man who taught Caleb how to ride a bike, the man who once stayed up all night building a lopsided toy chest because Caleb wanted one like the kids on TV. He wasn't just the man who left his son barefoot at a gas station. He wasn't just the man who reached for a bottle instead of his boy. He was both. And now, with nowhere left to hide, it was time to decide which one he was going to be. Late that night, when the craving was at its worst, Jacob pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the barred window. The stars outside were faint, almost washed out by the glow of the facility's floodlights. He whispered a single word into the darkness. Try. It was all he had. But maybe, just maybe, it was enough. What we run from. The common room at Clear Horizons was quieter than usual. Group therapy had ended early after two new residents got into a shouting match over who stole whose cigarettes. Jacob sat in the corner, back pressed against the faded wallpaper, Caleb's photo resting on his knee. The edges were softer now, curled from too much handling, but Caleb's smile hadn't faded. It was the only bright thing in the room. 3 weeks. 21 days sober. The longest he'd been without alcohol since before Caleb was born. The quiet scared him more than the withdrawal ever had. With the poison drained from his veins, there was nothing left to drown out the voice in his head, the one that sounded a lot like his old man. You're just like me, his father's voice whispered, the memory so vivid Jacob could almost feel the hot breath against his ear. A screw-up, a drunk, a waste. Jacob clenched his fists until his nails bit into his palms, the pain grounding him in the present. You're not him. You're not. The memory wouldn't loosen its grip. Jacob had been 8 the first time his father left him alone overnight. The night air crept through the cracks in the old trailer's walls, and Jacob sat at the kitchen table, a cold can of SpaghettiOs open in front of him, untouched. The kitchen clock ticked so loud it felt like it was counting down to something. The front door had slammed hours earlier, his father's parting words slurred but clear. Don't wait up. Jacob hadn't. He fell asleep curled under the kitchen table, the thin blanket doing nothing to block the sounds of his father's return. Stumbling footsteps, a crash of glass, then silence. It was always the silence that scared him most. The next morning, his father didn't apologize. He didn't say anything at all, just sat at the table with a cigarette between his fingers, staring at Jacob like he was something to regret. You'll end up just like me, he said, voice thick with flame and bitterness. Might as well accept it. Jacob had sworn that day he'd never be like him. He'd sworn it every day after, even as the first beer at 17 turned into sneaking shots in the garage at 22, and eventually driving Caleb around with a half-empty bottle under the seat. The door to the common room creaked open, dragging Jacob back to the present. Gerald stood there, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Visitor for you, Gerald said. Interview room 2. Jacob's stomach nodded. No one visited people like him. No friends left. No family, unless you counted the people who only showed up when they needed money. There was only one person it could be. Her. The hallway felt too long. Every step scraped against the floor, the sound stretching out like a slow, painful confession. The door was already open when Jacob reached it. Evelyn McLean sat at the small metal table, her hands folded in her lap, her purse tucked neatly beside her chair. She looked smaller than he remembered. Older, too, the fine lines around her mouth deeper, her hair more gray than brown. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt too heavy, clogged with the weight of everything unsaid. You look. She stopped herself, scanning him like she was cataloging all the damage. You're sober. For now. Jacob's voice was hoarse, like the words hurt to speak. Evelyn's fingers twitched, knuckles pale from the force of her grip. They asked me to take Caleb. Jacob's jaw tightened. I know. They didn't have to ask twice. There was no accusation in her voice, no bitterness, just a simple statement of fact. That hurt more. I didn't want you to be the one, Jacob admitted, the confession scraping out like rusted nails. After everything. Evelyn flinched, just barely, but enough that he saw it. I know. Silence stretched between them, heavy with history. The night she left, the slammed doors, the years of absence. She was the first person to teach him how to leave. He learned the lesson well. I was scared, Evelyn said, voice soft but steady. Of him. Of staying. Of what I was becoming. You left me with him, Jacob said, the words no longer angry, just tired. I know, she said again, softer this time. And I've regretted it every day. Jacob wanted to believe her. But belief was a luxury sobriety hadn't given him yet. How's Caleb? He asked, desperate to steer the conversation somewhere safer. Evelyn's face softened. He's holding up. He asks about you every night. The image hit him square in the chest. Caleb, clutching his lion, whispering questions into the dark. When's Daddy coming home? Did Daddy try today? Does he hate me? Jacob asked quietly. No, Evelyn said, and the certainty in her voice startled him. He loves you, but he's scared. He needs you to show him you're not going to disappear. Jacob swallowed hard, guilt curling low in his stomach. Do you want to write him a letter? Evelyn asked, pulling a small notebook from her purse. He'd love to hear from you. Jacob stared at the blank page, the emptiness of it almost too much to bear. What could he say to a 4-year-old to explain why his father wasn't there? Evelyn placed a pen beside the notebook. Just tell him the truth. The truth, such a simple thing. And yet for so long, Jacob had hidden behind lies. To Caleb, to the world, to himself. Slowly, he picked up the pen. His hand trembled, the weight of the words heavier than anything he'd carried before. Dear Caleb, I'm sorry. I wish those words could fix everything. I wish they could make me the dad you deserve. But I know they can't. So instead, I'm going to tell you the truth. I'm in a place called rehab. It's where people like me go when they've made too many bad choices and don't know how to stop. I'm here because I need to learn how to be your dad again. The kind you can count on. The kind who doesn't break promises. Some days, it's really hard. I want to give up. But then I think about you. I think about how brave you are, how strong you are. And I know I have to be strong too. For you. I don't know how long it will take before I can come home. But I promise you, I'm trying. I love you more than anything in the whole wide world. I hope you still love me too. Love, Dad. When he finished, his hand was shaking so badly he could barely fold the paper. Evelyn took it from him gently, slipping it into her purse without reading it. Some things were just between father and son. I'll make sure he gets it, she said softly. Jacob exhaled, the weight in his chest easing, just a little. I'm trying, he whispered. Evelyn's hand brushed his. Not a hug, not forgiveness, but maybe the smallest step toward something better. I know, she said. For the first time in a long time, Jacob believed her. That night, alone in his room, Jacob lay on the too-thin mattress, Caleb's photo propped on the nightstand beside him. The letter was gone, but the act of writing it had left something behind. A crack in the wall he built around himself. A flicker of light in the dark. He touched the photo, his fingers tracing Caleb's smile. Try, he whispered. Tomorrow would come. The cravings would come. The memories would come. But so would the choice. And tonight, for the first time, Jacob thought maybe, just maybe, he was strong enough to choose right. The breaking point. The clock on the common room wall clicked over to 2:00 a.m., but sleep was nowhere near Jacob McLean's grasp. He sat on the thin mattress in his room, arms folded over his knees, staring at the ceiling. The fluorescent bulb above him flickered at uneven intervals, the light creating brief flashes of brightness against the white walls, then plunging the room back into gray. It was the kind of light that made you see things Things from the past. Things you didn't want to see. 29 days sober. The weight of it was suffocating. Jacob hadn't realized just how much silence could hurt until sobriety forced him to sit still long enough to hear his own heartbeat. No buzzing numbness to drown it out. No fire in his veins to soften the edges. Just him. Raw, exposed, naked before every mistake he'd ever made. Somewhere down the hall, a man was crying. Not loud, but the kind of weeping that came from the chest, like he was trying to cough up whatever was rotting inside him. Jacob didn't know who it was. In here, everyone cried eventually. Jacob wanted to. But no tears came. They never did. Instead, he stood, the floor cold beneath his bare feet, and crossed to the small mirror mounted above the sink. His reflection was thinner than he remembered, eyes sunken but clearer than they'd been in years. There were new lines on his face, too, carved by guilt and withdrawal, etched into the spaces where alcohol used to smooth things over. A stranger stared back at him. The kind of man Caleb might hide from. That thought twisted in his chest, like barbed wire. A sharp knock startled him, and the door creaked open. Gerald, his broad-shouldered counselor, stepped inside without invitation, holding a thermos of coffee and a file folder under his arm. "Can't sleep?" Gerald asked, as if he already knew the answer. Jacob just shook his head. Gerald set the thermos on the desk and dropped into the only chair, flipping open the file. "We need to talk about something you've been dodging." Jacob tensed, his shoulders a coil ready to snap. "I'm doing the work," he muttered. "Group. Journaling. All of it. Surface work." Gerald didn't even glance up. "You've been working hard at looking like you're working hard." Jacob's jaw clenched. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Gerald said, finally meeting his gaze, "you're staying busy enough not to feel. That's what addicts do. You can swap the bottle for distractions, but if you don't face the root of it, you'll be back where you started." Jacob's stomach churned. "I'm here for Caleb, not for psychoanalysis. And that's exactly why we need to go deeper." Gerald slid a photograph across the table, a black and white picture from Jacob's intake file. Jacob, barely 19, glassy-eyed, half asleep in the back of a police cruiser, arrested for public intoxication. Jacob's fingers twitched at his sides. "That was a lifetime ago." "Not really." Gerald's voice softened. "Your father was already dead by then." "Right." Jacob's whole body stiffened at the mention. "What does that have to do with?" "Everything." Gerald leaned forward, elbows braced on his knees. "Every man who's walked into this place has a story, and most of them start with their fathers." Jacob stood abruptly, pacing the small room, unable to sit still under the weight of that truth. "I'm not my father." "No," Gerald said, "but you're haunted by him. That's why you drink." The words hit like a hammer. Jacob squeezed his eyes shut, but memories slammed into him like waves. The sound of his father's belt snapping through the air. The sting of whiskey-scented breath against his cheek. The lock on the front door clicking when his mother left and never came back. His fists curled at his sides, nails digging into his palms until they almost bled. "Why the hell would I want to remember any of that?" Jacob's voice was a hoarse whisper. "Because you're carrying it, whether you want to or not," Gerald said calmly. "You don't drink because you're weak, Jacob. You drink because you're trying to bury him. But he's inside you, and no amount of whiskey's going to drown him out." Jacob's legs gave out, and he slumped onto the bed, hands shaking. His father's voice, low and cruel, echoed in his ears. "You're worthless. You'll always be worthless. Caleb will hate me," Jacob said, voice barely above a whisper. "If he ever finds out." Gerald's expression softened. "He won't hate you for being broken. He'll hate you if you run from it." The next morning, group therapy felt like standing naked in front of a firing squad. Every word dragged out like a confession. Jacob sat in his usual chair, hands clasped between his knees, Caleb's photo tucked into his pocket like a shield. The group was waiting. Gerald had told them today was Jacob's turn to talk. "I don't know what to say," Jacob started, voice rough. "Start with your father," Gerald said. The air left Jacob's lungs in a rush. He didn't talk about his father. Not to Caleb, not to Evelyn, not to anyone. Talking about him gave him shape, made him real again. But they were all staring at him, waiting. "My dad," Jacob said, his throat tight, "was a drinker." No one reacted. They all were. He was mean when he drank. Not loud mean. Cold mean. He didn't hit a lot. He didn't have to. His words did all the damage. Jacob's voice cracked, but he kept going. "He used to tell me I'd end up just like him. That it was in my blood." The words tasted like poison, but he forced them out. And I believed him. Jacob stared at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. I thought if I stayed numb, I could prove him wrong. But all I did was become the thing I was running from. Silence filled the room. No judgment. No pity. Just understanding. The kind that came from people who'd stood in that same fire. "He's gone now," Jacob said softly. "But I still hear him. Every time I look at Caleb, I wonder if he's seeing me, or seeing him." Gerald's voice was quiet, but strong. "That's not how it works." Jacob finally looked up. "How does it work?" "You get to decide what Caleb sees," Gerald said. "Not your father. Not your past. You." That night, after lights out, Jacob lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling again. But this time, the silence felt different. It wasn't empty. It was full of possibility. And pain, and guilt, and hope. All of it jumbled together, impossible to untangle. He reached under his pillow, pulling out a sheet of notebook paper. "Dear Caleb, today I told the truth about something I've been running from my whole life. It hurt, a lot, but it made me think about you, and how I don't want you to grow up carrying my weight. I want to be the kind of dad who tells you the truth, even the hard stuff. The truth is, I'm scared. I'm scared I'll mess up again. I'm scared I'll let you down. But I'm trying, buddy. Every day. And when it gets too hard, I think about you. The way you held on to me that night at the gas station. You didn't let go. And I won't either. I love you. Dad." Jacob folded the letter carefully. Adding it to the small pile of letters Evelyn promised to give Caleb when the time was right. It wasn't much, but it was real. He lay back down, Caleb's picture still in his hand. "Try," Jacob whispered to the dark. The word didn't feel like a burden anymore. It felt like a map. The last door. The door to Clear Horizons Rehabilitation Center stood open, but Jacob McLean couldn't move. His hands gripped the strap of his worn duffel bag so tightly his knuckles were white, sweat slicking the creases between his fingers. The air outside smelled too fresh, too clean, like the world was brand new, and had no idea what kind of man was about to step into it. 90 days sober. 90 days without whiskey, without excuses, without hiding behind the bottle to drown out the voice in his head that sounded too much like his old man. He had walked into Clear Horizons a ghost, a man whose son was safer with strangers than with him. He walked out a man still learning how to stand up without leaning on anything but his own 2 legs. "Jacob," Gerald's deep voice pulled him back, the man's bulk blocking the doorway for a moment. "One more thing." Jacob turned, duffel slipping lower on his shoulder. Gerald held out his hand, and in his wide palm rested a small bronze chip. 90 days sober. Jacob stared at it for a long moment before closing his fingers around it. The metal was warm, heavy with meaning, a weight both comforting and terrifying. "You earned it," Gerald said. "But it's just a token." Jacob knew what that meant. The work wasn't over. The chip wasn't a trophy. It was a reminder. One slip, and everything it stood for could vanish in a single night. "I'll see you at the weekly meetings," Jacob said, and for the first time in months, he actually meant it. Gerald gave him a rare smile, brief but real. "Damn right you will." The door closed behind him with a heavy final thud. The sun was blinding. After 3 months of institutional light and air recycled through vents, the sky seemed too big, too sharp, like the world was daring him to handle it sober. 1 foot in front of the other, Jacob reminded himself. He wasn't walking out for himself. He was walking out for Caleb. The courthouse hadn't changed. The same gray walls, the same creaky wooden benches, and the same worn-out air that smelled like cleaning fluid and desperation. Jacob sat outside courtroom 4B, elbows braced on his knees, staring at the floor tiles like they held the answers to questions he couldn't even form. Evelyn sat beside him, her purse perched on her lap like a shield, her back ramrod straight. They hadn't spoken much since she'd arrived, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much. "You look better," she said softly, her eyes flicking to him briefly before settling back on her hands. "Thanks," Jacob muttered. He wasn't sure if it was true, but he had weight again, not just on his bones, but in his presence. He wasn't shrinking into himself, wasn't hiding behind exhaustion or booze-sick sweat. He was there, in every painful second, feeling every inch of it. "Caleb knows you're coming today," Evelyn added after a beat. "He's excited." That word, excited, made Jacob's chest tighten until it hurt. His son, the boy he had let down more times than he could count, was excited to see him. That kind of grace didn't come easy, and it felt heavier than any judge's sentence. The bailiff opened the door. "McLean hearing," he called, voice bored from too many broken families passing through the same door. Jacob stood, knees shaking but holding. Inside the courtroom, Judge Keegan sat at her bench, her glasses low on her nose, her silver hair swept into a no-nonsense bun. The same woman who'd looked at Jacob 90 days earlier and told him this was his last shot. To her left, the representative from Child Protective Services sat with a neat stack of reports and files. To the right, Evelyn sat beside Caleb, his legs swinging under his chair, his lion clutched tight to his chest. When Caleb saw Jacob, his whole face lit up. "Daddy." The boy's whisper filled the quiet room like a shout, uncontainable, too full of hope to be silent. Jacob's knees almost gave out right there. The court clerk read the case file, her voice mechanical and cold. "This is the custody hearing for minor Caleb McLean, reviewing the parental fitness of Jacob McLean following court-ordered rehabilitation and supervised visitation." The judge glanced at Jacob over her glasses. "Mr. McLean, you've had 90 days in residential treatment. You've submitted to weekly testing. Your attorney has filed your compliance records. Is there anything you'd like to say before I rule?" Jacob's throat went dry. He hadn't prepared a speech. What could he say to sum up 3 months of pain, shame, and hope in a handful of sentences? Finally, he spoke. "I messed up," Jacob said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I've messed up a lot. But for the first time, I know why." The judge's eyebrows lifted slightly, but she said nothing. "I've spent my whole life trying not to be my father," Jacob continued. "But I never learned how to be someone else, so I drank to forget who I thought I was." Caleb's lion slipped off his lap, landing with a soft thump on the floor. But he didn't reach for it. He was watching his father. "I can't promise I'm cured. I can't promise I'll never struggle again," Jacob said, voice cracking. "But I can promise I'm done hiding. I'll show up. I'll tell the truth. And I'll try. Every single day. Because my son deserves that." The room was silent. Then the judge spoke. "Thank you for your honesty, Mr. McLean." She turned to the CPS worker. "Your recommendation." The woman stood, hands folded over her file. "Based on Mr. McLean's compliance, his consistent participation in therapy, and the bond he's maintained with his son during supervised visits, we recommend transitioning to joint custody with a structured visitation plan." Jacob exhaled, his knees threatening to buckle again. "Miss Turner?" the judge asked, looking at Evelyn. Evelyn stood, smoothing her skirt with hands that trembled slightly. I was scared when I took Caleb in, she admitted. Not just for him, but for Jacob too. I wasn't sure if he could do this, but I've seen him fight, and I believe he deserves the chance to be the father Caleb needs. The judge's gaze lingered on Jacob for a long, heavy moment. Mr. McLean, she said finally, parenting is not a reward for sobriety. It's a responsibility, one you'll have to earn every day. You've made progress, but the real work starts now. Jacob nodded, the weight of her words settling into his bones. I understand. Temporary joint custody granted, with unsupervised visitation and continued counseling, the judge declared. We'll review your progress in 6 months. The gavel came down, but Jacob barely heard it because Caleb launched himself out of his chair, running full speed toward him. Daddy. Jacob caught him, arms wrapping tight around the boy's small frame, Caleb's weight grounding him in the reality of this fragile, beautiful moment. I'm so proud of you, buddy, Jacob whispered, voice thick with tears. No, Caleb whispered back, his arms squeezing tighter. I'm proud of you. Jacob's breath caught, and for the first time in years, he let himself cry. Not from shame, not from withdrawal, but from something pure, relief, hope, and love, all tangled together. That night, back at his small apartment, Jacob tucked Caleb into bed for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. The stuffed lion sat on the pillow beside him, its worn mane familiar and comforting. Daddy. Caleb's voice was sleepy, eyes half closed. Yeah, bud. You gonna stay? Jacob swallowed hard, brushing hair back from Caleb's forehead. Yeah, he whispered. I'm gonna stay. You promise? Jacob leaned down, kissed his son's forehead, and whispered the word that had carried them both through the darkest nights. Try. And this time, he meant it with everything he had.